In this video, we are going to wrap up our discussion on Chapter 30. We're going to start this video discussing what are known as active labor market policies. Right. So in the last video, we introduced the idea of structural unemployment, and we talked for a very long time about some of the things that cause the kind of high levels of structural unemployment to persist in European countries, right, versus the United States. Right. So again, when we have a bump in unemployment in the U.S., it usually goes down relatively quickly. In many European countries, it tends to stay high for longer. Right. So we discussed some of the reasons for that. Now, with these active labor market policies, we're going to talk about something that can help reduce the levels of structural unemployment. All right, which are these active labor market policies? Probably should have put a line there. It's not really a heading. It's more of a this is what we're talking about with these active labor market policies. All right, these are laws focused on getting people back to work. All right, through training and job search assistance. I'm going to put et cetera because there's also some other things, but these are the big ones, right? So training and job search assistance, right? Giving people the training they need so that they can compete in the labor market, right? Increase their skill levels, increase their kind of value to potential employers, right? Help them get a job easier, and then also just helping them search for a job. Right. Again, this is kind of very short definition for what these are. Probably a lot of stuff goes into these, but this is one way if you have these active labor market policies. Again, really just encouraging people to be active in the labor market, getting higher, increasing their human capital, increasing their training, and helping them just find a job at all. Right. If we have those kinds of policies. Right, that can help us lower those structural unemployment rates. All right, so that's it for structural unemployment. We probably could have done that one in the last thing, but that probably would have made it about a 40-minute video, and I don't think anybody wanted that. So now let's talk about the last type of unemployment, which is cyclical. Right, and we are not going to spend a ton of time on this at all. All right, probably even less than with frictional. All right, so cyclical unemployment is unemployment that is correlated with the business cycle. All right, so for our cyclical unemployment, what we are talking about is this is when we have kind of a bust, an economic bust, kind of an economic downturn, right? We're going to expect to see higher levels of unemployment, right? Kind of economic downturn, right? More unemployment. When we have a boom, right? An economic, a good economic time, I guess you could say, a period of economic growth or whatever, that is when we would see lower unemployment, right? Unemployment would decrease. If the economy is booming, more businesses are opening, more jobs are available, people, right, are getting those jobs, fewer people are unemployed. When we have an economic downturn, some businesses close or cut back on hours for their employees, what have you. We're going to see higher levels of unemployment. All right, so that is cyclical unemployment. Tied to it pretty closely is the idea of the natural rate of unemployment. All right, or as I've got it written in my notes, the natural unemployment rate. All right, so we expect to see some level of unemployment, and in fact, really, an unemployment rate of 0 might be cause for concern, right? That really means that nobody's moving from job to job, kind of things have just stagnated. All right, also that you just wouldn't expect to have no unemployment. All right, but the natural rate of unemployment, this is the rate of structural plus frictional unemployment. Oh, that's it. That was the end of the sentence. Full stop. That can't be right, though. All right, well, yeah, the rate of structural plus frictional unemployment. All right, that is the natural unemployment rate. This is also considered the underlying rate of unemployment. So essentially all we're saying with the natural unemployment rate, right, we're just not including that cyclical unemployment. We're not including that unemployment that correlates with the business cycle, right? So this is the underlying rate of unemployment that changes slowly over time. All right, so kind of if we're looking at our unemployment rate just overall, which is what we do, it would be incredibly difficult to try to untangle frictional from structural from cyclical unemployment, and that's why we just have a single unemployment rate. Right, but this structural and frictional unemployment rate, right, this is essentially the trend line. All right. So if we imagine a graph, all right, on the horizontal axis we are looking at time, so this is over time. The vertical axis is the unemployment rate, so the unemployment rate over time. All right, if we're just looking at the unemployment rate as it is, all right, it might look something like this, all right? So we'll say, we'll cut it off there. So this is just kind of your unemployment rate. All right, that's probably a little bit more jagged than it should be. All right, what our natural unemployment rate would be is the line that kind of moves through this, all right? So it might be might look something like this, all right? This blue line would be our structural plus frictional right? That underlying rate, the kind of steadier rate, it's not going to change very much over time, right? But oscillating around that, we're going to have the unemployment rate just in general, right? And so you could essentially say, right, the difference between the purple line and the blue line, that's your cyclical unemployment. That's the unemployment that correlates with the business cycle, right? And it might change kind of rapidly, right? Month to month, quarter to quarter, right? It might change a lot, but that natural unemployment rate is going to change much more slowly, right? Changes in the kind of how well the economy is doing, those aren't going to have a huge effect on the rates of frictional or structural unemployment, right? Those aren't, that has nothing to do with the kind of the friction between employee and employer, right? You're going to have the same, probably, roughly the same amount of that, even in an economic downturn as you would have in an economic boom. And then it also doesn't just change kind of an industry, right? It doesn't destroy an industry. It doesn't eliminate an entire group of workers or type of job, right? It just moves around with how well the economy is doing, right? But that is our natural rate of unemployment, or the natural unemployment rate. All right, now let's talk about labor force participation. All right, so labor force participation, really, well, we don't need to dance around it that much. So what we're interested in ultimately is finding out our labor force participation rate. All right, so what is the rate at which people are participating in the labor market, right? The higher that is, all right, arguably the better. All right, so our labor force participation rate, all right, that's going to be calculated as the labor force divided by the number of eligible workers times 100%. All right, here with these eligible workers, I often will, well, not often, but I will sometimes also refer to those as the adult population. So if you see adult population, that's the same thing as eligible workers. What defines somebody as an eligible worker are essentially the exact same things we looked at to determine whether or not somebody would be considered unemployed or not. The only difference is that they don't need to be looking for a job to be an eligible worker, right? So as long as they are 16 years old or older, not institutionalized, and a civilian, all right, if they meet those three criteria, they are considered eligible workers. All right, and of course our labor force is simply the number of unemployed plus the number of employed workers. All right, so let's turn once again to our to May 2020. And we know that our labor force was 158.227 million, right? Or if we don't remember, we know now, right? And our adult population, our eligible workers, is equal to 260.047 million. All right, so to calculate our labor force participation rate, we just need to divide our labor force by our eligible workers. So our labor force participation rate is equal to 158.227 divided by 260.047 times 100%. Right? And when we punch that into our calculators, that is going to give us a labor force participation rate of 60.8%. All right, and that's seems pretty standard for the U.S., at least as far as I have seen. Last September, so September, I guess, last September 2019, the labor force participation rate was 63.2. I didn't actually write it down, but I think the May 2019 labor force participation rate was like 62.1 or something like that, right? So that's kind of in line with a lot of what we saw. All right, now granted, one of the reasons that is still probably high, partially is because the unemployment benefits have been kind of generous lately. So a lot of people had more of an incentive to go claim those benefits and stay in that looking for work or whatever, staying in that number, that labor force number. All right, but that is how we calculate our labor force participation rate. All right, now we're going to wrap up by talking a little bit about some of the determinants of the labor force participation rate. All right, there are two that we're going to talk about. The first one, actually, we'll just write these up here and then talk about them as we go. Life cycle effects and demographics. All right, so these are the same one, so this is the same thing. So when we're talking about life cycle effects, right, we're really talking about, you know, how does where you are in life, and I mean by that I mean what age you are, not where am I, but where are you at kind of as far as your age, how does that affect your likelihood of participating in the labor force, right? If we look, right, there are kind of two big groups of people that are less likely to be engaged in the labor force, right? One is young people, all right, so kind of people you know, once you turn 16 when you're in high school and then up through college, if you don't end up working, all right, there's a good number of people that aren't engaged in the labor force then, right? And then also we have retirement age people, all right? Once you get retirement age, you're likely to retire, right? So you're not going to be involved in the labor force, right? So if we have really high percentages of the population in either of those categories, right, that's going to have a big effect on our labor force participation rate, right? That's where these demographics come into play. All right, in 2018, 16% of the population was at retirement age, that's 65 years old or older. All right, I'm not going to write these down, but the labor force participation rate for people 65 to 74, right, for 2018, right, was 27%. All right, so that's much lower than that 60.8 that we saw, and you know, whatever it was when I was looking at this. Was that 18 or 19? It doesn't really matter. Yeah, anyways. Right, that's much lower, right? And if you go and look at the CPS tables where they break out kind of unemployment and labor force participation by age, which I'm sure you're all going to do because it's very fascinating, right? You're going to see that the rates, the labor force participation rates for kind of working age people are much higher, right? If you're only looking at working age people, it goes up to 72, 75% labor force participation rate. But then you have the 65 to 74, right? 27%, right? Which I'm not dogging the 65 to 74. If you're that old, like, a quarter of you are still working, or trying to work, that's pretty good, all right? And then over 74, so 75 plus, it's 8.7%, all right? So very few people that are 75 years old or older are working, which is kind of what you'd expect, all right? But all that to say, all right, so you can kind of get the idea that, all right, as we know that as we get older, right, the likelihood that we're going to be participating in the labor force gets lower, right? In 2018, 16% of the population was 65 years old or older. In 2030, it's estimated that 20% of the population will be 65 years old or older, right? So really what we're getting at right now with this is we've got a very large portion of the population that is reaching retirement age / will be reaching retirement age very soon, right? The baby boomers, right? So as they get to that retirement age, right, the demographics of this country are going to change, right? We're going to have a larger percentage of people in this kind of portion of the life cycle where they're much less likely to be participating in the labor force. So we can probably expect to see a decrease in the labor force participation rate, right, going forward as more baby boomers begin to retire, right, and take up a larger portion of the population. All right, so that's one of the determinants of the labor force participation rate. The other is incentives. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and write all three of these down. I'm not going to expand on these too much, at least not on the board, right? But incentives matter, right? What are the incentives people are facing to work, right? Well, taxes aren't an incentive. They're actually more a disincentive, right? The higher the tax rate on somebody's earnings, the less likely they are to participate in the labor force, right? If, in an extreme case, right, if you're going to tax me at 100%, so in other words, everything I earn, I have to give to the government, there's no incentive for me to go to work, right? I'm not going, at that rate, I'm not going to go to work. I'm not going to be participating in the labor force, right? But also, it works on the less extreme examples as well, right? But the higher your tax rates are on income, the lower the incentive is to work. And so you would likely see lower labor force participation rates, right? Because it's just not worth it to expend that energy to not reap the benefits. All right, speaking of benefits, right, if we have a lot of benefits, all right, that are going to go to whether we're talking about kind of when we or essentially any benefits for people who are not working, right? It's the same thing as taxes, right? If you can get unemployment benefits, if you can get any other kinds of benefits when you're not working, right? Then that makes not working more appealing, right? And so if you have high levels of kind of unemployment benefits or things like that, then you might expect to see higher levels of labor force participation rate. Right, now that can be combated by doing things like I think what we do here in the US, which is to get those benefits you have to go to some government office, right? You have to show that you are trying to find work, so on and so forth, right, to receive those benefits, right? But if there are benefits just kind of out there, right, then you're less likely to work if you can just get something without having to work, right? I wish I could do that, but sadly I cannot. All right. Then finally, cultural factors. All right. We're going to put that in the incentives spot because kind of conforming or not conforming, right, to society. Right. There are incentives to do either one, right, depending on what you're looking at. Right. But right, changes in cultural factors are going to change labor force participation rates. Right, probably the biggest example of this in recent history is the kind of movement of women into the labor force. Right, so kind of the era, you know, the early 20th century. Right, so kind of the 30s, 40s, 50s, probably even I guess the 60s as well. Right, there was a very strong idea about what a woman's role was, just in general, in society in general, but also within kind of a marriage, right? And that was to stay at home, take care of the kids, take care of the house, right? Well, when the women's liberation movement kind of started, right, that started to change, right? And so you had more women moving into the labor force, all right, and so we saw an increase in the labor force participation rate, right? So that is, those are the kind of two of the factors that are going to determine the labor force participation rate, and that's it for this chapter, all right? I don't really have anything to wrap up with. I should stop doing that. Anyways, so that's it for this chapter. I will see you guys in the next video.